Can a graveyard be haunted? It's a question asked many times by enthusiasts of the paranormal. Some argue that cemeteries aren't haunted. Why would a person's spirit want to haunt the place where they were buried? The Oakland Cemetery in Atlanta, Georgia, is a location determined to prove that burial grounds can be haunted. It's the city's oldest cemetery still in existence. By 1850, around 2,500 people lived in the area, and 6 acres of land were purchased with the intent to turn the land into a public burial ground. It was designed as a garden cemetery, which was considered to be an alternative to more traditional graveyards. Originally called the Atlanta Graveyard, or City Burial Place, it was renamed Oakland in 1872 to reflect the large number of oak and magnolia trees. By that same year, the cemetery had expanded to 48 acres due to pressure brought on by the Civil War. The city government, along with the Confederate government, added land so that soldiers who had died in nearby hospitals could be buried there. After the Civil War ended, soldiers who had been buried quickly on area battlefields were exhumed and buried at Oakland. Even the administrative space and visitor centre at the cemetery has a connection to the Civil War. Both places are housed in the Bell Tower, a building which once served as the HQ for Confederate Commander John B. Hood during the Battle of Atlanta. In 1862, Union operatives called Andrews Raiders took over a train at present-day Kennesaw and travelled north to cut telegraph lines. They were caught and declared spies. 7 of the raiders were hanged near the southeast corner of the cemetery. They were interred at Oakland before being moved to the National Cemetery in Chattanooga. The Civil War has definitely left its mark on Oakland. A memorial marker for the Andrews Raiders can be found in the cemetery. The Lion of Atlanta guards the graves of 3,000 unknown soldiers. The Confederate obelisk, which at 65 feet or 20 meters tall, was once the tallest structure in Atlanta, and it stands close to where John B. Gordon, Lucius J. Gartrell, Clement A. Evans, and William Wright are buried. All 4 men served as Confederate generals. Roughly 6,900 Confederate soldiers are buried there, along with 16 Union soldiers. It's believed that the Union soldiers were buried in the cemetery because of little burial space elsewhere. Oakland was a popular place for picnics and carriage rides in the 19th century. The first greenhouse in Atlanta was built in the cemetery in 1870. Typically, each family would look after their loved ones' graves, creating variety in the types of plants that grow there. Many of the flowers planted were favourites of the dead. The last burial plots were sold in 1884, and the gate and perimeter walls were added in 1896. The original 6 acres of the cemetery can be found just inside the gates. A lack of ironwork in the original 6 acres and across the cemetery is noticeable, as the city of Atlanta gave the original ironwork to the US government for use in producing weapons in World War I. While the cemetery was a peaceful place to visit, it was also a clear reminder of the differences in religion, class, and race. Sources vary as to how many people were interred at Potter's Field. It covers 7.5 acres, with at least 7,500 people buried there. An archaeological survey carried out by Georgia State University, however, suggests that as many as 17,000 people are buried at Potter's Field. The residents of Potter's Field were all interred there before 1900, at the city's expense. If you ended up in a Potter's Field, it was because you were too poor to be buried in a private lot, or you didn't have any family to pay for the burial. The new Jewish section of the cemetery can be found close to the old section, located in the original 6 acres. The Hebrew Benevolent Congregation bought the new plots in 1878 and in 1892. Along with traditional grave markers, evidence of a German Jewish culture mixing with American culture can be seen in the gravestones. This area of the cemetery was vandalised by two teenagers in 1982. Oakland had a separate section to bury African Americans in. There is a distinct lack of headstones in this area, as many of them had been made from wood. Antoine Graves, an Atlanta realtor, is the owner of the only mausoleum in this section. Oakland was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1976. Over 70,000 people have been interred there, but there are only 40,000 grave markers. There are over 1,400 trees in the cemetery, with some being close to 200 years old. A tornado in March 2008 uprooted over 100 mature trees, but donations allowed 114 trees to be planted. The cemetery had to be closed for cleanup in 2017 after Hurricane Irma caused destruction. The cemetery averages one burial a month, and the historic Oakland Cemetery is working on restoring the burial ground, as long as there are funds available. About $15 million is currently needed to continue restoration. People flock to Oakland from all over to visit the cemetery's most famous residents. At Oakland, you'll find the graves of Gone with the Wind author Margaret Mitchell and the first African-American mayor of Atlanta, Maynard Jackson. There's also a monument for Atlanta's first mayor, Moses Formwalt, who was also Atlanta's youngest mayor at 28. Carrie Steele Logan, who founded the first black orphanage in Georgia, is buried there, as is architect Andrew Steiner, a Holocaust survivor who saved 7,000 Slovakian Jews by convincing Nazi officials to create workshops staffed by the Jewish. Finally, there's Oakland's first resident, Dr. James Nissen. He was visiting Atlanta when he became ill and died. Dr. Nissen was so afraid of being buried alive that he asked for his jugular vein to be cut before burial to make sure he could avoid the thing he feared the most. Many cemeteries have tales associated with them about statues coming to life. Oakland is no different. Real estate investor Jasper Newton Smith is a resident of the cemetery, and a statue of him sits in a chair atop his mausoleum. At night, he is said to get out of the chair and walk the cemetery. It's the Civil War that has had the most supernatural impact on the cemetery. Soldiers have been seen walking around, and the sound of a bugle has been heard. One tale dates back to 1891. A woman visiting the cemetery laid a wreath on the grave of a loved one. The sun was in the sky and everything appeared to be normal until she looked up at a large tree in the southeast corner of the cemetery. Hanging from the tree was a soldier dressed in a blue uniform. The woman immediately thought of the Union soldiers who had been hanged as spies close by. Another story involves a young man named Blair Breckenridge, who had gone to Oakland to place flowers on his grandfather's grave. Something caught his eye as he left the cemetery. Lying on a grave was a Confederate soldier with a bloody chest wound. Blair bravely walked up to the soldier, who suddenly opened his eyelids. Rather than seeing a pair of eyes looking back at him, Blair stared into two black holes. The soldier slowly turned his head and vanished. Imagine yourself at Oakland Cemetery. Imagine wandering around the burial ground, taking in the peaceful nature of the place. It's the month of November, and, in particular, the anniversary of General Sherman's march to the sea. You start to hear names being called out, along with faint responses to each name. You've become one of many people to hear a ghostly Confederate roll call at Oakland. It's said to be one of the Confederate generals buried there who calls out the names. There's nothing to worry about. It's simply an echo from the past. Then you hear your own name being called. Happy nightmares.